Joining us now, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who is reporting from Washington, D.C., MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, host of Can They Do That on YouTube. Catherine Christian is former assistant DA for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and an MSNBC legal analyst. Rick Pildes is constitutional law professor at NYU. It's great to have such a panel with me right now. What we're hearing from the Hill, from Democrats, who obviously were watching this closely, Lisa, is all basic rights are now under attack. What does this ruling say and mean?
Well, let's talk about what it says and what it doesn't say. It certainly restricts the ability of lower courts to issue nationwide or universal injunctions, but it doesn't eradicate it completely. It leaves open the possibility that in certain limited cases, in order to get what Justice Barrett calls complete relief, it may be that a particular party needs a nationwide injunction. That's almost never going to be the case if I, Lisa Rubin, am the plaintiff. But for example, as she allows, it may be the case that the states that have brought two of the suits here that were at issue, Chris, may need a blanket nationwide injunction to vindicate the rights of their citizens. Why? Because of what they call cross-border flow and the fact that they are distributing benefits on the basis of citizenship. They say that if this only applies, for example, in the states that have litigated, but otherwise the Trump administration is free to implement this birthright citizenship executive order, the patchwork of legality, so to speak, will make it so administratively impossible for them to determine who is not a citizen. They'll have to track the parents of all babies born in their state, as well as the birth state of any baby who then becomes a resident of their state. So it may be the case in the end that the states do, in fact, get a nationwide injunction. The majority leaves that for another day. But more globally, the restriction on nationwide injunctions mean that a panoply of issues that Democrats care about are very much at risk. Everything from gun violence to reproductive choice is now, as Attorney General Matthew Platkin put it to me in an interview earlier this week, dependent on the state in which you live and whether or not you have an attorney general who's willing to fight to vindicate your rights, as opposed to do you live in a state governed by Republicans that are willing to capitulate to President Trump.
Rick, this was considered birthright citizenship a basic constitutional right. You're born in America. You are an American. Donald Trump clearly sees this very differently. Let me play for folks exactly what he said.
And some of the cases we're talking about would be ending birthright citizenship, which now comes to the fore. That was meant for the babies of slaves. It wasn't meant for people trying to scam the system and come into the country on a vacation.
You're the constitutional expert here. Is he overreading this decision?
Well, let's be completely clear. The decision has nothing to do with the question of whether birthright citizenship is or isn't constitutionally protected. The majority didn't address that question. The decision has no direct bearing on that question. There are now 6 lower federal courts that have addressed the merits of that. They've all concluded that the executive order is unconstitutional. So the substance here is going to be litigated through the judicial system, ultimately to the Supreme Court. Today was just about the scope of remedies that federal courts have, and that's where the Supreme Court cut down the universal injunction and held that injunctions can't be extended to non-parties in cases. But I also want to say about that, consistent with what Lisa was saying, although the administration celebrates this as a complete victory on that question, like most Supreme Court decisions, there's a lot more nuance here. And there's still a lot of ways to get broad relief if an executive order is found to be illegal. Class actions can be brought. Everybody in the class will be protected by the injunction. There are associations that may have hundreds of thousands of members. In fact, in this case, there is one group like that. An injunction would protect all of their members. States may have standing in certain contexts to challenge certain executive orders, and the relief would go then perhaps to all state residents. So this definitely cuts back some on the scope of federal court remedial power, but not as broadly as I think some of the headlines are going to suggest.
And I want to go further into that, but can we just do one more question on the birthright citizenship? Because even though the reality is this is not a ruling saying birthright citizenship exists or doesn't exist, if you have birthright citizenship, if you are a woman who came in from another country and who was pregnant and about to deliver, what do you say to those folks? You just got to wait and see.
That's exactly what you say. It's true that this decision did not say it's constitutional or unconstitutional. It's strictly about the nationwide injunction, but it does leave in the air, particularly depending on what state you're in. Probably not in New York, but maybe Arkansas or in another state. You don't know what's going to happen.
So we have a lot of people who have suggested that there are now two Americas. And the way you live your life, the rights that you have, depend on what state you live in.
It does. Unfortunately, that's true, because we are sort of divided between whether it's a blue state or a red state and basically your state legislature. What are they going to do? You know, you can get an abortion in one state and have it severely limited in another state. So that is the America that we now live in.
And that is exactly what the president and Pam Bondi were railing against. They feel that the injunctions that were put against moves that were made by this president only came from blue states, and that, by extension, taints those judges and their decisions.
That's interesting because, first of all, I want to talk about the judges. When Rick was referencing the 6 district court opinions that found the executive order on birthright citizenship to be unconstitutional, those 6 orders came from 4 judges, and they evenly divide between judges appointed by Republican presidents and judges appointed by Democratic presidents.
Let me point out that is the exact opposite of the implication that was given at that press conference.
That is absolutely true, but I will tell you that the judge in New Hampshire granted a preliminary injunction appointed by George W. Bush. The judge in Massachusetts who granted one is an Obama nominee. The judge in Maryland who granted a preliminary injunction, a Biden nominee. And finally, the judge in the Western District of Washington is a Reagan nominee. That just completely belies the description that President Trump gave of all of these judges who are curtailing him as radical left judges. Time and again, he uses that characterization without any context for who these people were before they were judges or how they judge in other contexts. But I want to pick up on something that Catherine said, if I can, Chris, because she was talking about two Americas. Justice Jackson talks about this in a way in her dissent as well. And she's not talking about where you live per se, but she's saying there are 2 zones that the administration wants to live in. They want to live in one zone where they will abide by the law with respect to orders that are issued against individual named pregnant plaintiffs. And then there's another zone where they are essentially saying all bets are off. We might obey the law, we might not obey the law. And in fact, at oral arguments, Solicitor General John Sauer said even if a federal appeals court were to uphold a preliminary injunction in one of these cases, he's not sure that the administration would abide by it. It wouldn't be until he got to the Supreme Court and got a definitive ruling up or down on the executive order that he would commit that the Department of Justice and the Trump administration would comply with it.